Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. There are 4 congressional districts in the Bronx, but only one of them, the 15th Congressional District, is only in the Bronx. Tonight we're joined by the representative from the 15th CD to talk about the race for president, Israel and Gaza, and a number of Bronx issues. So joining us from Washington, D.C. on Skype, Congressman from the 15th Congressional District. Welcome back to Bronx, Congressman Ritchie Torres. Representative Torres, nice to always have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I almost called it the Council District, but that's deep in the past for you. Listen, we've got a lot to talk about, and front and center is the race for president. Before we even talk about Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, just a word, if you would, about Joe Biden. Did you think that President Joe Biden should step down before he made that decision to do that?
Well, look, the decision by President Biden to step aside and pass the torch to a new generation of leadership, for me, was a demonstration of statesmanship in the tradition of George Washington. It was the right decision both for the party and for the country. And history will record that Joe Biden had one of the most transformative presidencies in American history. You know, he passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which has set our country on a trajectory to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 30%, by 40% by 2030. He passed the boldest piece of infrastructure legislation in more than a half a century. He has positioned the United States to be a leader in emerging technologies like AI and advanced semiconductors in the 21st century. So history will judge President Biden kindly, and his decision to step aside for a new generation of leadership is an unprecedented act of statesmanship.
So you didn't quite answer the question, but you think ultimately he did the right thing?
Oh, I believe I agree with the president's decision to pass the torch. It was the right thing to do. And Vice President Kamala Harris represents a next generation of leadership and the future of the Democratic Party.
I have to ask you this question. It seems rather incredible that I have to ask it. But yesterday, now we're recording this on Thursday, yesterday former President Trump questioned Vice President Harris's ethnicity, and, as if like she decided to be black one day. I don't even know what to say about it. It just seems so bizarre. Democrats have called them weird. What was your reaction when you heard that, or you may have even seen it, when he said those things?
Well, it came as a shock to me, even though the racism of Donald Trump should no longer be shocking. But it goes to show that Donald Trump is panicking. He's lashing out out of desperation. He built his whole campaign around running against President Biden. And with the emergence of Vice President Harris as the nominee, he has seen the world around him collapsing. His campaign is in a state of confusion. And he's resorting to the only thing he knows, which is racism. But, who on earth made Donald Trump the arbiter of blackness? And it is certainly...
I'm sorry for laughing. It is rather incredible.
It's the ultimate irony given Donald Trump's own history of racism. And he insists that she's not black, she's Indian. It never occurred to Donald Trump that in a multiracial society, you can be both black and South Asian. Like, it's not either or, it's both and. I'm both black and Latino. It is possible to have multiracial, multi-ethnic identity.
You were one of the most outspoken people when he came to the Bronx. I thought that was interesting. Of course, I think you made some comment about the rain that happened, that it was, somehow significant. But talk about him in the Bronx, and it seemed so out of place. I mean, we have one Republican elected official. It is essentially the bluest county in America. What did you make of his appearance over there in Crotona Park?
Well, it's not out of place at all, because Donald Trump is a malignant narcissist with delusions of grandeur. I mean, here's a man who is so delusional as to declare himself the best president for African Americans, possibly even better than Abraham Lincoln, who abolished slavery. So a man who has that kind of delusion is delusional enough to think that he could win the Bronx, when in fact, Donald Trump is less popular in the Bronx than the Boston Red Sox and the New York Mets, in which he's ever going to win the Bronx. The Bronx is Harris country.
What does Vice President Harris have to do to win at this point? And you know, if you were counseling her or her campaign, what would you advise her to do at this point?
I mean, she should keep doing what she's doing and let Donald Trump self-destruct. I mean, Donald Trump is a fatally flawed candidate. He's his own worst enemy. And every time he opens his mouth, he does an enormous amount of damage to himself. So she has been staying above the fray. She's been on message. I'm confident that she's going to select a vice president who's going to excite the country. I feel like the emergence of Vice President Harris as the Democratic nominee has been both a lifesaver and a game changer for the Democratic Party in the presidential election.
What do you have concerns? I mean, there's been a lot brought up. The way the Republicans are casting it is that she was, the czar for the migrant crisis on the border, and they say she failed. Are those kinds of things? Will those kinds of things resonate with many Americans who are concerned about that issue?
No, because I think Vice President Harris will have the best of both worlds. Typically, you have to choose between change and experience. In the case of Vice President Harris, you have both. You have, she can credibly claim to have experience because she has served for vice president for 4 years, but she also represents change. She represents a new generation of leadership, something quite different from President Biden. And so the ability to offer the combination of both change and experience is a powerful advantage in the presidential race against Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is no longer the younger candidate. If he were to win, and we should prevent that from happening, but if he were to win, he would be older than President Biden.
Kind of remarkable how that's turned around, and I guess it goes back to what President Biden did in stepping down and creating this scenario. I wonder, I'm assuming you don't know the answer to that. I wonder if he kind of knew that he was going to do this and then deliberately waited till after the Republican convention, et cetera, et cetera. Strategically, that seemed to work out. I don't know if you have any inside word on that, but it sure seemed like, whether it was planned or not, that was the most effective way if he was going to resign to do it.
Yeah, any comment from me would be pure speculation. But I had been overwhelmed by the energy, the grassroots energy that Vice President Harris has brought to the campaign. And she raised $200 million in the span of a few days, mostly from small donors, mostly from first-time donors. If that is not evidence of grassroots enthusiasm, I'm not sure what would be. And before Vice President Harris becoming the presumptive nominee, one of the challenges that we were facing was a lack of voter enthusiasm. And the voter enthusiasm gap has either been closed or it has moved to our advantage.
One more question, a line of questioning about the current president, and then we'll move on to some other issues. What do you think of his plan for the Supreme Court? It faces long odds in a divided Congress, no question about it. But he outlined a proposal that included term limits, an enforceable ethics code for Supreme Court justices. What do you think? Is he dreaming, or is this something that could actually happen in some form?
Well, I support reforming the Supreme Court. For me, one of the greatest challenges to democracy in America is the right-wing judicial activism of the Supreme Court. The role of the court is not to make the law, it is to interpret the law. But increasingly, we've seen the Supreme Court get in the business of making law. It is functioning as a super legislature in violation of the law, in violation of the Constitution. And why should it be the case that every component of the federal government is subject to an ethics code except the Supreme Court? Why should it be the case that every federal court is subject to an ethics code except the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court is not above the law. Everyone is accountable to the law. And the most egregious example of judicial activism was the Supreme Court's recent decision on presidential immunity. The court held that if a president engages in an official act that implicates a core presidential power, then he is absolutely immune from prosecution. There's nothing in the text of the Constitution that grants the president immunity, much less absolute immunity. So if the president were to order the attorney general to investigate and prosecute his political enemies, according to the Supreme Court, that is absolutely immune from prosecution. If the president were to accept a bribe in exchange for issuing a pardon, according to the Supreme Court, that is absolutely immune from prosecution. And if the president, as commander-in-chief, were to order the assassination of a political opponent, that might be absolutely immune from prosecution.
That's a rather remarkable concept and a remarkable statement to even consider. But what was interesting to me is Donald Trump has accused, every time that he's had to sit in front of a judge, he said, well, it's a Democratic judge and they're unfair. Is Biden stepping into kind of a difficult territory when he says, well, they're all right wing and so they only, rule in that direction, whereas Donald Trump says, well, if you say that, look at what happened to me with Alvin Bragg. These are Democrats and these are people who are appointed by Democrats. The judge was appointed by a Democrat. And then all of a sudden we're in this situation that rather than judging the law and interpreting the law, that the accusation is judges are just making decisions based on their politics.
I feel there's a difference between attacking judges as people, which is what Donald Trump often does, and critiquing the merits of their decision making. It should not be the case that the Supreme Court is exempt from criticism, right? The public has a right to critique all the branches of government, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. The Supreme Court is no different from the remaining branches of government. Ultimately, it should be accountable to the law.
Let's move into something else that came up. I know you know the article that was written about you by David Cruz in the City and State, which is a wonderful publication. A very thorough interview, I thought, with you and a profile piece. One of the quotes that is in there that really struck me was you saying, I didn't leave the progressive movement left me. Does that suggest you still see yourself as a progressive in some ways? Maybe you could just interpret that. I thought it was a fascinating point of view.
I think of myself as a pragmatic progressive Democrat. I'm a traditional liberal Democrat, who governs from a place of lived experience. Issues like poverty and inequality, food insecurity and housing insecurity, these are not abstractions to me. These are realities that I've lived in my own life, and those realities inform how I govern. And so I bring as much lived experience to public life as any elected official anywhere in the country. My life has been a journey from public housing in the Bronx to the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. To your question, the meaning of progressivism has been radically reshaped over time. When I first entered the city council, the progressive position on policing was police reform. Now it's become the defunding or the abolition of policing. The progressive position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was a two-state solution. Now it's become BDS, or the destruction of Israel as a Jewish state. And so I have been alarmed by what I have seen as the radicalization of the progressive movement, which often produces outcomes that are anything but progressive.
Let's talk about Israel and Gaza. You have been certainly outspoken and maybe one of the most ferocious supporters of Israel in the Congress. Again, we're doing this on Thursday, August 1st. There's fear that the strike a couple of days ago against the top Hamas leader might start a wider war. Are you concerned that that is the case? Well, that could be the case?
It's a risk that we have to monitor, but it's in no one's interest for there to be a war between Hezbollah and Israel. The war would be mutually catastrophic. It would be even more catastrophic for Hezbollah. Israel has a missile defense system known as Iron Dome that has been effective at intercepting more than 90% of the missiles that come from Hamas. But Hezbollah is an infinitely more powerful enemy than Hamas. It is the most heavily armed terrorist organization in the world. It's more heavily armed than most nation states on Earth. It has 150,000 rockets and missiles. A number of those missiles are precision guided and therefore can target the critical infrastructure of Israel. And Hezbollah has enough rockets to overwhelm even the capacity of Iron Dome. And so it's in no one's interest for there to be a war between Hezbollah and Israel that could ultimately draw in Iran, the United States, and set the stage for a regional conflagration.
The notion that Hezbollah had to, and the Hamas leader had to be attacked in Iran, that really complicates it because, of course, then all of a sudden you're entering another territory, and that makes it a wider, the potential, certainly we hope it doesn't, but the potential for a wider war. But on another level, does this complicate the efforts for a ceasefire in Gaza that could bring hostages home?
Well, I want to be clear. The leader of Hamas is responsible for the mass murder of 1,200 Israelis, the abduction of over 200 hostages. You cannot commit those war crimes, those atrocities, and then expect it to go unpunished. So Israel has not taken a responsibility for the assassination, but Israel has every right to defend itself against a barbaric terrorist organization that has perpetrated mass murder of its people, that is responsible for the deadliest date for Jews since the Holocaust. Regarding the ceasefire, the ball is in the court of Hamas. We all want to see an end to the wretchedness of the war in Gaza. But an end to the war requires the release of the hostages. Hamas has the power to end the war that it began and to release the hostages that it abducted. And so the international community should be directing pressure precisely where it belongs on Hamas. Hamas should be held accountable for releasing the hostages and agreeing to a ceasefire. Israel has put multiple ceasefires on the table, only to have it repeatedly rejected by Hamas. Hamas has been stringing along Israel, the United States, Qatar, Egypt, a whole range of international actors.
You mentioned the international community. Israel's actions in Gaza have brought condemnations, including criticism that they violated 28 resolutions of the United Nations Security Council. They have been widely condemned because of the killing of citizens, not enabling aid to get to citizens in Gaza. Have they complicated their own efforts to, number one, get to Hamas, and number two, bring peace to the region?
Look, if Hamas remains in power, there will never be security for Israel, and there will never be peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And if Hamas remains in power, then Israel's at risk of a repeat of October 7th. And that's not speculation. That's not theoretical. Hamas has said so. Hamas has said that October 7th is not a one-time event. It was a dress rehearsal. There will be a second and a third and a fourth. And Hamas seeks nothing less than the annihilation of Israel as a Jewish state. And we ignore those words at our own peril.
Is there another way to do it? Now, we realize that Hamas leaders, and I'm certainly not a military strategist, but Hamas leaders may be in the basement of hospitals or in tunnels or elsewhere. Is there another way to proffer this war that would spare many of the innocent civilians that have been caught in the middle? And I'll give you one example. When we went after Osama bin Laden, it was a pinpointed strike. We went right after him. Yes, I believe there were, a half a dozen deaths of people who were immediately around him. But other than that, we simply had the technology and the capability and the strategy to lift him out and take care of him. Is it possible to do that with Hamas leaders? Again, and I think worldwide, and I'm sure you are also concerned about innocent civilians who are getting caught in the middle of this. Is there a way to do this and not kill the tens of thousands of people who have lost their lives and children who have, lost care and everything else in Gaza? Is there another way to do this that would get the end result and still maybe preserve more lives?
Well, I have to disagree with the framing of the question, because you suggested that the United States had a targeted operation against Osama bin Laden, which is true, but what you left unmentioned were the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that had hundreds of thousands of casualties, particularly Iraqis, Afghanis. Like, the United States did not degrade the capabilities of Al-Qaeda without causing an enormous death toll in Afghanistan. So I feel like that's an important fact to emphasize. Look, I feel like there should be three goals. There's a humanitarian need to minimize casualties and ensure that Palestinian civilians are receiving the aid that they need. There's a diplomatic need to secure the release of the hostages. And there's a military need to remove Hamas from power in order to prevent a repeat of October 7th. And none of those objectives are mutually exclusive. We have to figure out how to achieve all of them.
Congressman, we could talk about these things for a long time, but we want to talk about our home borough of the Bronx, and I know you've been working very hard for the people of the Bronx. One thing that caught my eye were the grants for expanding Head Start in the Bronx through Grand Street Settlement. I know it's a program you're very proud of. Talk to me a little bit about your interest in doing that and what it has resulted in, which I think is as positive a sound that I've heard about the Bronx in a very long time.
Well, you're familiar with the words of Jimmy McMillan, who said that the rent is too damn high. The same could be said of childcare. I mean, childcare is so expensive that 80% of New York families cannot afford it. And according to the Federal Department of Labor, Bronx residents pay the highest in childcare costs as a percentage of their income. Like, we in the Bronx represent ground zero for the childcare affordability crisis in not only in New York City, but throughout the United States. And so, given the crippling cost of childcare, I'm proud to report that I partnered with Grand Street Settlement, one of the finest non-for-profits in the city, to secure over $50 million to open 6 childcare centers in the Bronx over the next 5 years. It's a real breakthrough for a borough that has long been struggling with the crippling cost of childcare.
Do you see a further expansion of these kinds of efforts, or do you think maybe this kind of investment will inspire people to realize how important an issue it is, and maybe something from the city's point of view legislatively could be done? I'm always interested. You've known me a long time. I'm always interested in the long-term effects of something like this, because I think this is about as positive a sign that I could see for the families of the Bronx.
Look, one of the greatest challenges in our society is inequality, right, between the so-called haves and the so-called have-nots. And those who are born into poverty have less access to childcare, less access to education. The research tells us that when you intervene early in the life of a child, you can produce lifelong benefits. You can close the vocabulary gap. You can close the achievement gap. And so I'm a huge proponent of childcare, early childhood education, early intervention to lift children out of poverty and set them on a trajectory to achieve the American dream.
Just a couple of minutes left. I want to ask you about the Bodega Act. This was something, bodegas in the Bronx. What could be more common than that? And you really put something forward that I think will allow them to be safer.
Look, there's an epidemic of violence against bodegas that has been ignored for far too long. Bodegas are soft targets for violent crime. As you know, bodegas often operate 24/7, often in dangerous neighborhoods in the middle of the night. In the Bronx, we saw a vicious sledgehammer attack on a bodega worker. And bodegas are fixtures in our community. These are the smallest of small businesses. And these small businesses often are at greatest risk of violent crime, but lack the resources to secure their establishments. And so I introduced the Bodega Act, which would establish a federal grant program that would enable bodegas to purchase security systems like surveillance cameras and panic buttons. You know, just like we have a federal program that provides security funding to non-for-profits, to vulnerable non-for-profits, we ought to have a federal program that provides security funding to vulnerable bodegas, which are at heightened risk of violence.
Do you, real quick on this, and then one last question, do you see this dialogue coming up in Congress before the election, or you think everything's going to be put off until, after the election?
Well, I intend to, press the issue. I will raise the issue with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus because, violence against bodegas have a disproportionately destructive impact on the Latino community, on the lowest income community, on places like the Bronx where bodegas are ubiquitous.
Last question, we got about 30 seconds. Can you just update us on the project to cap the Cross Bronx Expressway? Are we getting there? Are we closer? Where is it at?
We have a distance to travel. We're only at the beginning of the process, but I partnered with Majority Leader Schumer to secure $2 million for a community visioning process. We want the community to shape the vision for the transformation of the Cross Bronx Expressway. So the community visioning process, which is being run by New York City DOT, is unfolding over the course of a 2-year period. So we are in the second year. So toward the end, we hope to have a community vision for the Cross Bronx Expressway, and then the focus will shift towards securing funding for making that vision a reality.
Congressman, thank you so much for your time. You are always a willing participant in the dialogue, and we here at BronxNet and all the people of the Bronx couldn't appreciate it more.
Always a pleasure. Good to see you, Gary.
Nice to see you, Congressman. We got to run. Next week, we'll have a fun show. We'll do a taste test with some caterers, talk about how Bronx to Bronx local economies benefit the Bronx. Our producer is Rebecca. Our director is Will. We have a cast of thousands here. Yessi Diaz is our editor. And we thank you, and we'll see you next week.